Nuestra conferencia de hoy se llama Aprendiendo de otros sures, Alternativas al desarrollo en la India y más allá. Yo soy Miriam Lang, soy la coordinadora de la maestría en Ecología Política y Alternativas al Desarrollo y les estaré acompañando desde la moderación. Nuestro conferencista de hoy es Ashish Kothari, al que quiero dar la más cálida bienvenida. Welcome, Ashish. Thank you for being with us today. Ashish Kothari es un intelectual y activista de la India que trabaja en el fortalecimiento de alternativas multidimensionales de sociedad construidas desde abajo. Él ha sido docente de un instituto de administración pública de su país, ha coordinado el plan de acción y la estrategia nacional de biodiversidad de la India, es decir, tiene experiencia en política pública. También ha integrado las juntas directivas de organizaciones internacionales como Greenpeace y del Consorcio de Territorios Indígenas y Comunitarios Conservados, TICA, en su país. Esto es una amplia experiencia también en términos de ONGs y es uno de los fundadores de la organización Kalpavriksh, que significa árbol de la vida, en su ciudad natal de Pune, desde donde co-coordina el Vikalp Sangam, que es un proceso de confluencia de alternativas en muchas partes de la India. Y también ha cofundado y co-coordina una cosa más reciente, una iniciativa más reciente que se llama el Tejido Global de Alternativa, The Global Tapestry of Alternatives. Esto todo pueden averiguar en la web si quieren saber más acerca del trabajo de Ashish. Ahora, Ashish va a hablarnos en inglés. Por eso, las personas que quieran escuchar la traducción deben seleccionar en la parte de abajo, hacia la derecha de su pantalla, en el botón de interpretación, el idioma español, para que les aparezca automáticamente la traducción al español. Contamos con la traducción simultánea de Heather Hayes, a la que quiero agradecer de antemano por su colaboración en esta conferencia. Hemos organizado este ciclo de conferencias en colaboración con la Fundación Rosa Luxemburgo, a la que quiero agradecer su complicidad y su apoyo también en esta ocasión. Y la hemos organizado porque nos parece necesario en estos tiempos de crisis multidimensional, ahora agudizada por la pandemia, fortalecer los canales de comunicación, establecer primero canales de comunicación y de aprendizaje entre diferentes partes del sur global. Generalmente, si lo analizan, los flujos de información y también de conocimiento fluyen sobre todo de norte a sur, ya en menor medida de sur a norte, pero los vínculos sur-sur son obstaculizados muchas veces por razones geopolíticas, por una escasa infraestructura que vincularía los continentes del sur global, me refiero al sur geopolítico. Y por esta razón, con esta conferencia queremos un poco contrarrestar esos obstáculos. Queremos invitarles a viajar a la India, este subcontinente tan grande y poblado en el sur de Asia. La India es una de las partes del mundo con una enorme diversidad de modos de vida, donde un buen porcentaje de la población vive en zonas rurales, contrariamente a esta tendencia global de urbanización. Y la modernización capitalista enfrenta serias resistencias. Esto se evidencia actualmente en las protestas de millones de campesinos contra una nueva ley agraria en los últimos meses, por ejemplo. Entonces, hemos invitado a Ashish para que nos hable precisamente de estos modos de vida otros, de maneras otras de comprender y habitar el planeta en los márgenes de o en tensión con este mundo capitalista moderno colonial que pretende ser universal y para todos. Es a partir de ahí que podemos aprender, pensamos nosotros, estrategias para construir alternativas a un modo de vida que por un lado se nos vende como el único posible, el único deseable, pero al mismo tiempo nos lleva a la depredación del planeta que nos cobija. Ashish nos va a hablar desde su larga trayectoria de acompañamiento de procesos sociales que se resisten a ser modernizados, asimilados, subsumidos en el modo de vida occidental, consumista y capitalista. Nos va a dar cuenta también de sus fundamentos teóricos, filosóficos y de los debates más álgidos que existen allá en la India y en los circuitos que él camina alrededor de las alternativas al desarrollo, este paradigma supuestamente tan incuestionable. Podríamos hablar también de alternativas sistémicas. Y como él es un articulador de procesos de transformación entre los diversos sures del planeta, también seguramente nos llevará más allá de la India. Entonces, muchas gracias, Ashish, por estar aquí y no me queda más que pasarte la palabra.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. It's such a wonderful opportunity for me to be able to speak to and interact with audiences from different parts of the world. Maybe this has been the only silver lining of this COVID, that we get to, without having to be physically there, still be able to interact with a lot of people around the world. Though, of course, I completely miss the physical presence. So hopefully that will also be soon possible. So I'm going to speak for about maybe 40 to 45 minutes. I'll do very briefly some sort of an introduction to the sort of context of global crises that we are in. The reason I'm going to do it briefly is because anyway, the world is a bit depressing. So I don't want to depress people further. And also most people on a call like this are somewhat familiar with crises. I'll spend much more time on looking at the alternatives to development, as you have indicated. Thanks to USP and of course to Rosa Luxemburg also, and you and everybody else, and to Heather and others who have been part of organizing this. Heather, please let me know if I speak too fast. Part of our colonial inheritance in India is that we speak very fast English. So let me know if I'm going too fast. Okay. You see the slides? Miriam, the slides are visible?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Go ahead, Ashish.
Okay. Great. I think, like I said, everybody's familiar with one or more of the kind of crises that we're in, and these crises manifest themselves wherever we are in our local, regional contexts. They're ecological, socioeconomic, political, cultural, and connected to all of these, also very personal. Just very quickly, I think one of the things that we have to confront is that many of these crises, or all of them, are in one way or the other linked to the forms of development, especially globalized development, that we've seen in all across the world in the last few decades in particular, but of course going back to also colonial and other historical roots. And we see in this model of development, as you see from this advertisement of an Indian multinational corporation, that when it comes to progress, if nature is in the way, in fact, this advertisement called nature a barrier. If nature is in the way, it has to be uprooted and shoved aside. And of course, also if there are people living in that forest, they would also be displaced in the process. So in that sense, development, what we've seen across the world, is very intense form of violence against the rest of nature and against communities. Now, we've seen the impacts of that in terms of the runaway global climate crises, the crisis of erosion of biodiversity, of pollution, and much else, where we know that we are already on a steep path of unsustainability of various kinds. But what we also see is linked socio-economic crises. For instance, the same model of development and its capitalist roots and so on have created even further levels of inequality, probably the highest levels of inequality ever experienced by human societies. This is true for the whole world. It's true for India. In India, for instance, right now, 5% of the population is earning more than the rest of the 95%. And I think probably the world's single biggest single family house, which is what you see in this picture here, is of India's richest man, who owns one of the biggest corporations here in a city in which 50% of the population do not have adequate housing. That's in Mumbai. We also see that this process of development is intensely has a very severe negative impact on us personally in many different ways. In terms of, first of all, the loss of traditional livelihoods on which hundreds of millions of people depend, whether it's farming or fisheries or crafts or forestry or other kinds of traditional and primary sector occupations, especially. Um, and then their movement into the so-called modern sector, in which for the majority of population, these are extremely mechanical jobs. They're part of large supply chains and production chains in which there's very little creativity involved, in which there's very little job satisfaction involved. And I call this whole process, the destruction of those livelihoods and the creation of these kind of mechanistic, soul deadening jobs, as a process from livelihoods to deadlihoods, which has characterized modern development over the last few decades. Also, I think what's very important to point out is that this is a process. When we think of development, that is economic growth based development, as being the sole driving force for economies around the world, barring a couple of exceptional countries. And if anybody then protests against it in defending their land, in defending their forest, in defending their water, and their basic human rights or the rights of nature, then both governments and corporations hit back. And they hit back with either trying to bribe people or co-opt them, or worse, of course, violence, including killing. And we know that more than 4 people are killed every week just trying to defend their territories. Right now, in fact, many of us are involved in a struggle against the Indian state, which has cracked down on very young climate activists who have been supporting the farmers' movement, which Miriam, you spoke about, and calling them anti-national and part of international conspiracy and so on. Finally, in this section, I'd just like to point to the fact that over this last 1 year of what has been an unprecedented era in human history, we've seen 2 directions that people have taken. One is the business as usual, and in fact, worse than business as usual, where some governments or many governments of the world have become even more authoritarian in the name of surveillance, in the name of health crises, and so on. And where corporations have used this as an opportunity to become richer and richer and richer. That figure that you see on the slide there of $583 billion more made by a few billionaires in the COVID period is actually already 4 or 5 months old, so it's probably much bigger now. But on the other hand, we've also seen an outpouring of community solidarity, of people working with each other, people reaching out to elderly people or the poor or to laborers, etc., in trying to help them overcome the kind of period of crisis that we've seen in the last 1 year. And so what I think we have right now, as societies and countries build out of the COVID crisis and build recovery packages, is we have this very clear choice: either business as usual, or as somebody very recently told me, it's not even business as usual, it's just business, and or fundamentally transforming our societies towards systemic transformations, which is what I will speak about now. And so that raises this question: are there alternatives? Do we have a different way of doing things? In India, for instance, we're told we have to, of course, there is destruction of environment, there is displacement, but we have to go through that route in order to become rich enough for them to be able to protect the environment, which we know, of course, is a completely false argument. So then the question arises, what are these alternatives? And I think in order to respond to that, it's very important for us to ask, alternatives to what? We get a lot of very simplistic solutions given to us by the system. Keep producing waste and recycle it. Keep emitting carbon, make sure it's captured somewhere else, the zero net carbon kind of thing. And what this is telling us is that the current system, which has created the problems in the first place, unless we challenge that, we are going to get these superficial solutions. And to my mind, put in a very simple way, the roots of the crisis are the concentration of power, the power to dominate, not the power to do something good, but the power to dominate in the hands of corporations under capitalist systems, in the hands of the state, in statism, state dominated regimes, including, to my mind, state socialism, in the hands of men over women, which is, of course, much older, in the hands of, in the case of India, the so-called upper castes over the so-called lower castes. India is an extremely casteist society, and I can explain that later for some of you who may not fully understand it. In the hand, in racism, etc., and in the hands of human beings over the rest of nature. I mean, it seems like we've taken upon ourselves the the sort of ability to rule the earth in the way that we want, and it doesn't matter what that means to 50 million other species. So if we really want to look at alternatives, we have to be able to fundamentally challenge that, because otherwise we continue coming up with these superficial solutions which only reinforce the system, whether it's green growth or geoengineering or carbon fixing or whatever, including, I think, sustainable development, at least in the way they're framed in the Sustainable Development Goals, some of which are excellent and much better than the Millennium Development Goals we had before that. But overall, the framework and the context still remains internally extremely contradictory. For instance, one of the goals is about economic growth. And to my mind, that simply doesn't work for sustainability. So then, okay, let's take a look at what are these alternatives. Firstly, and very importantly, to my mind, resistance, people's resistance against these forces of destruction and inequality and so on, is very much part of the alternatives. This picture is from about 30 years back. It's a movement. It was a movement by indigenous people in central India against the construction of two very large mega hydroelectricity projects, which would have displaced several hundred villages and destroyed the forests there. But when these people were arguing against the dams, they were not talking only about their livelihoods and so on. They were also saying that this river is our mother. It is spiritually important for us, and we will not allow our mother to be shackled by dams. You, as in the government, think of the river as megawatts and power. For us, it's a mother. So what we're seeing in these movements of resistance, and I know there are many in your part of the world, what we're seeing there is alternative ways of articulation, of knowing, of being, of relating to the rest of nature and to each other, which are very, very important. I'm seeing this in forms of resistance of many, many different kinds. The anti-racism movements in the US and elsewhere, the current farmers movement in India, which is talking about how India is probably the last country where there's still a huge number of farmers that haven't got corporatized. They haven't got caught in the corporate world. But these three new laws that the Indian government is bringing in is attempting to push them in that direction, and they're protesting against that. Or the movements by young activists against the climate crisis, or the movements in Chile, for instance, for a new constitution, and the good news from your own country, from Cuenca, where the referendum was against extractivism and mining. Now, in addition to resistance, we also need, of course, constructive solutions to meet people's needs and aspirations. And what we're seeing is thousands and thousands and thousands of examples of that around the world. I'm going to talk about very quickly about a book that some of us were involved in, which has 100 examples of these. I just wanted to put up this map with a few names, not just because of the names, but also I wanted to put this map up because, at least in India, maybe Miriam, you can tell me whether that's the case for you also. Most people looking at this map will say, oh, why is it upside down? And this brings up a very interesting conversation of how the map that we think of as normal, where Europe is on top and Europe is made to look much bigger than it actually is actually a product of colonization. And so, the decolonization of our minds is in so many different dimensions, including the maps we're using, the language we use, etc., that which we have to be able to address if we want to get to systemic solutions. Now, I'm much more familiar, of course, with the Indian context. And over the last few years, we have been documenting hundreds of examples of alternatives for basic needs, for gender justice, for education, for health, for governance, all kinds of different things. And I'm going to give you just a very quick glimpse of some of these. I could take hours and hours just talking about these examples. There are two or three that have inspired me the most. One of them is what's called the Deccan Development Society, which is about 5,000 women farmers, very small scale women farmers who belong mostly to the Dalit community. The Dalit is the so-called untouchable community in India, the most oppressed part of Indian caste society. So they are oppressed from patriarchy and they're oppressed in casteism. They're also very small landholders. So even from a class perspective, they're on the margins. In the last 30 years, these women have moved from a situation of hunger and deprivation and malnutrition to what they call not just food security, enough food in their homes, but food sovereignty, which means complete control over everything to do with food, the land, the seeds, the water, and the knowledge. They've brought back a lot of their own traditional varieties of seeds. They have shifted completely to organic. They have secured land rights for the women, which is very unusual in India, and created a lot of community systems of exchange with each other so that people who don't have enough seeds, for instance, get it from somebody else, creating grain banks. And amazingly, the same women whose families were facing hunger 25 to 30 years back have now contributed to the district, the local relief fund with grains for those families who don't have enough to eat during the COVID lockdown period. The second example I want to give is from forested India. These are indigenous populations. India has about 7 to 8% of its population is classified as Adivasi, which is indigenous. And here in central India, there's been a long-standing movement of the indigenous communities fighting for self-governance. And here, these are 90 villages that have got together as a sort of a federation of village assemblies to, number one, fight against mining projects that the government wants to bring in there. And but second, also assert their self-governance, assert their protection and governance and management of the forest, create situations for women to be empowered as equally, to be able to have equal voice with the men, and also assert their own cultural identity as indigenous people, not as Hindus, not as Muslims, not as Christians, but as indigenous peoples who are the oldest peoples in India. And they draw inspiration from one of the villages which 30 years back declared that even as we elect the government in New Delhi, in our village, we are the government. And I'll come back to that notion of democracy in a while. Going to cities now, I think it's very important to look at what kind of urban transformations are taking place. So this is a town in Western India, which has faced the same problems that every other urban area in India faces, which is of lack of access to civic amenities for the poor people, high levels of pollution, traffic, congestion, etc., etc. Here, a few of the local civil society organizations have worked with the citizens of many of the colonies in this, especially the poorer colonies, to reach levels of self-reliance, especially with things like water, housing, sanitation, and now energy, waste management, but also to assert that as the residents of the city, we have every right to the planning of the city and the budgets that are made for the city as anybody else. Why should we leave it only to politicians and to bureaucrats to make the city's plan and the budget? So asserting their right to self-governance also in an urban context, which is so important for them. And we see some kind of similar movements in other parts of the world. For instance, the movement towards feminist municipalism. Barcelona is a very interesting example where a woman mayor over the last few years has tried to shift the planning of the city and the governance of the city away from the sort of centralized, corporatized control to a much more participatory method, a much more solidarity-based method, much more a method by which you try and bring various political party interests into joint decision making. Not easy, not always possible, many problems, but at least the attempt is there. And then to create cities of dignity and fearless cities, which means where refugees in Europe who are otherwise marginalized are able to live with dignity, or others who are in the margins are able to live with dignity, such as, for instance, disabled people, so-called disabled people. Um, so I moved already into looking at things outside India. Here's an example from your part of the world where, similar to the Dalit women farmers I spoke about from India, these are Quechua indigenous peoples in Peru, in the Andes highlands of Peru, who have also had a very similar movement over the last 30, 40 years, and governing their entire landscape, protecting a landscape which is where the potato originated, conserving and using 1,300, more than 1,300 varieties of potato. It's amazing. I was there about 10 years back, and my mind was blown just looking at the diversity of potatoes. And in the COVID period, actually contributing food for relief work in the nearby town of Cusco. And interesting also to look at how they've tried to mix their traditional governance systems with modern democracy, to see what's the best of both worlds that they could lead to. This is somewhere where I was able to go a couple of years back when I came to Quito, in fact, and for the first time was able to travel to the Amazon, one of my dreams in life, and spent 5-6 days with the Sapara Nation. And here also it's interesting how they've tried to retain their ecological and cultural roots, their spiritual connections with the forest as much as the material connections, but also deal with the external world through, for instance, community managed ecotourism or health tourism. And trying to sort of create that hybrid system which retains their roots but also enables them to deal with the outside world. There are thousands or maybe tens of thousands of what we call territories of life, where communities, either using their traditional systems or creating new ones, are protecting nature, protecting wildlife, protecting ecosystems, and also enhancing their own livelihoods in the process. The other one that I find extremely inspiring, though I haven't been able to visit that yet, is the Kurdish women's movement in the middle of the most war-torn part of the world, the Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria area between them, where the Kurdish ethnic community has tried to create a region, a large region of relative peace and of ecologically based, feminist-based governance systems, very radical levels of radical forms of democracy, and trying to create also economic self-reliance. There's a lot available of this on the web for those who are interested in going further. And they use an ideology called genealogy, which is Jin genealogy, which is really a sort of an eco-feminist ideology. I think final set of examples. This is from very different contexts up in Europe, where young people, especially in cities, have tried to create what is called a social or solidarity economy, an economy of the commons, in which profit making is not the objective. The objective is to live well, to have fun while having economic enterprise, and to be able to reach out to those who actually need it the most. So each of these merits a full hour of description, but just to give you a minute each. On the bottom right-hand side is a factory that has been taken over by the workers and run in a completely democratic manner. For every hour of work done by anybody in that factory, regardless of what work you're doing, you get paid exactly the same amount as everybody else. And there is no boss. It is run by all the workers in a joint democratic way. The school that you see on the top right-hand side is run by what's called time banking, partly by time banking, where parents and people from the neighborhood contribute their services as teachers or administrators as much as the teachers who are paid. And because of that, the school is very cheap, but very high quality. So even kids of poorer families are able to send their students there. So time banking is a very interesting phenomenon coming up in a lot of industrialized countries. Of course, traditionally, it's been there in our societies for a long time. But it was kind of forgotten in modernization and capitalism. The one on the top left-hand side is a kind of a social center, which became very important for the poorer parts of Lisboa in Portugal, the poorer people, because it became a center where they could come and get a good, healthy food, interact with people, be able to have actions of solidarity for themselves. The bottom left-hand side is a local currency, which is in Luxembourg. And this is again something that's becoming more common, especially in Europe and the US, some parts of Africa, where people are saying, why should we be so dependent on the euro or the dollar or the lira or the peso or the rupee, which is controlled centrally by banks or governments? Why can't we have, at least for some localized exchanges, our own currency or our own way of exchanging in a way that's fair? So this is something that's used by 5 communities in Luxembourg, where, like, if I'm a consumer, I can go and buy bread using the Bekie currency. The bread maker can go and buy wheat from the farmer. The farmer can use the same Bekie to go to a doctor and get services. It's usefully used even in schools to pay fees and so on. What that does is it stimulates the local economy. And as I said, it reduces at least some of the dependence on the centralized currencies. Now, I've mentioned a few examples to you already of where communities, having built these systems, were much more resilient in the COVID period. And we are in India documenting many dozens of examples of these. We're coming out with a whole series of publications to do that. And through a global process, which I'll mention at the end, we're also now beginning to do that more globally. I think already about 15 to 20 cases have been put together, and we're just currently designing it and going to put it out soon. And it's very important to learn the lessons of how these communities were able to survive and cope and thrive through the COVID period, whereas in many other parts of the world, there was chaos and unemployment and hunger and so on. Now, I think one very important, 2 additional important things, and then I'll get to the sort of framework of transformation and end, is that a lot of the problems we're facing are also partly a result of a very faulty education system. We've had, especially since colonial times across the world, an education system that teaches us as children or young adults, teaches us to be selfish, individualistic. Our main goals in life have to be are about becoming famous and rich and powerful and so on. Very little of the teaching is about how we are human beings, individuals within a collective context. That we are dependent on the rest of nature, and that interdependence has to be respected. Very little is about retaining our own cultural and ecological roots, even as we learn everything from the rest of the world. So these are some examples from different parts of the world where this has been turned around, and education and learning is about being able to enhance my own internal creativity, working with other students or young people, and all of us trying to move up together in life, working not just with the mind, but also with the hands and the heart, which is, Mahatma Gandhi's one of its most important principles was this triple education, what he called the Nai Talim, the hands, the heart, and the head. And just to remind ourselves, one of the things I find very interesting is to go back to the origins of words. So, for instance, here, when I started working on this, somebody told me that the word school comes from the original word skole in Greek, which means leisure. At least in India, 95% of schools are prisons, nothing to do with leisure. So, sometimes also the way in which language gets distorted by the system. And finally, of course, I think there's a whole bunch of examples around the world of alternative media, technology, arts, the democratization of these, which has unfortunately got captured by the corporate sector or by the governments of the world. How does one bring that back into democratic control and be able to put our voices out to and not just hear the sort of distorted messages coming from the mainstream media? So again, these are some examples from India where this is being attempted. Okay, let me now move to the final part of the presentation. Take another 10 minutes or so, which is looking at what are the sort of larger visions of transformation emerging from these sorts of examples. Yeah? And the way we look at it here, some of us, is that transformation is happening or should be happening in 5 different spheres of life. Of course, these are highly interconnected, so somewhat artificial distinction I'm making. But politics, economics, society, culture, knowledge, and environment or ecology, right? And I'll go into a couple of minutes into each of these. And if you take politics, the community in central India or the Sapara nation in the Ecuadorian Amazon and many others around the world are arguing that democracy is about us being in control, that it is about people's power, not the power of politicians we elect and not the power of the bureaucrats in central governments or so on, but where we are. And of course, we also then uh, have movements to make, if there is still a state, and that's a question that we can discuss later on, then we make the state accountable. But where we are and for decisions that affect our lives, we should be at the core of that decision. That really is democracy. Again, going back to origins of words, democracy, power of the people, or rule of the people, not rule of politicians and bureaucrats. But so then how do you make the larger systems of governance also accountable? This is something we can come back to in our discussion. And one of the most interesting things that arises out of that is that if we want to think of political decision making that is respectful of environment and culture, then we have to also question our current nation state boundaries, many of which are products of colonial history. In South Asia, for instance, I'll just show you a map of that, where because of colonization, we've got boundaries between some countries which make no ecological sense, no cultural sense whatsoever. And it's created a whole series of continued conflict-like situation around the world. In the discussion, I'll come back to this issue of, if we want to move towards this kind of radical democracy, we also need 4 conditions to be met. People have to have the rights to decision making. We have to have the capacity to participate meaningfully in it. We have to have forums which are accessible to us. And of course, there's a whole complex discussion on wisdom and maturity in taking decisions. But we can maybe in the discussion come back to that. Very quickly, looking at South Asia. Right now, we have conflict situations between India and Pakistan, India and China, India and Nepal, India and Bangladesh, uh, Nepal and China, etc. And one of the reasons is because there are these fences or walls in between, which have created massive problems both for the biodiversity of the area, but also the peoples living in those areas who never asked for those walls and fences. It's people in Beijing and New Delhi and so on who actually have created this. And of course, the colonial powers to some extent, at least for parts of South Asia. Now, can we imagine a South Asia that is borderless, where people and wildlife can go back and forth freely, as was there, of course, in earlier history? So this is something that a lot more thinking has to be done. The second sphere of transformation is that of economics, without which the political transformation will be inadequate, because there's no point in my being able to decide for my village unless I also have control over my means of production and consumption. So, but also that economy as part of ecology. Many of us tend to forget that the word economy and ecology both comes from the word oikos in Greek, which means home. And how can we manage home, that is economics, without understanding home, which is ecology? So in fact, economics needs to be part of the ecological system. But this transformation of economy also is in terms of moving away from the dependence or the hyper dependence on globalized economies and trade and so on, to much more localization, which at least for basic needs. I should not have to depend for my water or food on somebody 500 kilometers away. It should be within a certain local, and it's eminently possible to do that. But that localization also has to be open, in the sense it can't be the fascist the neo-fascist right wing in Europe saying, oh yes, we are for this, which means no refugees to come here. Europe is only for Europeans, whatever that means, right? So so there's a crucial political and cultural angle there also. The local control of production, worker-led production, and rather than capitalist or state-owned systems, bringing back leisure in the work. The Western system, the Western world has told us 5 days of work, 2 days of weekend, and we wait desperately for the weekend to enjoy ourselves. But if the work we do was enjoyable, we wouldn't have this distinction. We could take a break whenever we want to do something else or whatever. But there's this 9 to 5, Monday to Friday kind of division that has been created? How do we break out of that? How do we recommon private properties? And by that, it's not just physical property, but also intellectual property. The fights against privatization, against intellectual property, right? The fights for open source systems, the fights for recommoning of urban lands, moving, instead of car parks to actually have common gardens, for instance. And the examples I gave you of local currency, of demonetization in a good way. India had a demonetization which was disastrous, but I can tell you more about that later. But demonetization in terms of reducing the dependence on centralized currencies in our own systems. The third sphere of transformation, equally important, is the struggles for equality and equity among gender, sexualities, age, etc., etc. I don't think I need to elaborate this. It's fairly obvious that this has to be a core part of the struggles also. The fourth sphere is that of culture and knowledge. And we have seen across the world, India is a very good example of that, an incredible diversity of ways of knowing, of ways of creating and generating and transmitting knowledge, and cultures, food systems, languages, all kinds of stuff, right? How do we create a respect for that diversity and struggle against the kind of homogenization that modern westernization has brought, but also the homogenization of one dominant culture over the other, which could be modern culture, but it could also be, for instance, in India, Hinduism over all other religions, in Pakistan, Islam over all other religions. So you have to also think about, how does that diversity reflect itself in terms of mutual respect. And then with that, the democratization of knowledge, which I already spoke about, the decolonization of our minds, bringing back arts and media and technology into the commons, and the opportunities for us not just to struggle outside, but also to look within ourselves and deepen ourselves from a spiritual point of view. Finally, the fifth sphere is that of nature, which is our relationship with the rest of nature. I keep saying rest of nature because we tend to think of nature as outside of human beings. But I think the image on the bottom left-hand side says it all. Modern science and modernization has told us that human beings are at the pinnacle of evolution. We're the most intelligent, etc. If you see the way we've treated the world, I would say we're probably the stupidest. But anyway, that's what we're told. Whereas for thousands of years, indigenous people and other traditional communities have said we are one out of many, many, many species, right? So why should we be so proud of ourselves? We should be humble and respect all of life. And that's really a huge systemic transformation that the modern world certainly has to make. And at the core of this flower of transformation is the most important part, which is that of values and ethics. Which so because one of the things is that people often ask me this: how do you upscale these examples, or how do you replicate these examples? And I'll come back to that in a minute. But my response has always been, it's not about duplicating or replicating any such example somewhere else, because every place is different, every place is unique. There's a huge diversity, right? So, but it is about learning the principles. It's about learning what are the values and the ethics that are emerging from these examples. I'm just going to put this out there without discussing all of them. We don't have the time. But to me, it's this and additional values that I'm sure all of you can think of, which is the core that we're talking about, which are the heart of the matter. I've been talking about many of these things. It's about self-governance, not allowing somebody else to govern us. It is about the collective and the commons, not about individual selfishness and privatization. It's about not just human rights, but also the rights of the rest of nature. It's about happiness being not buying bigger and bigger television sets and the newest iPhone, but about having good social relationships, good family relationships, being able to enjoy ourselves in human and other natural company, and so on. I mean, we can think of and talk about this also during the discussion more. And every culture has had its own ways of actually talking about these sorts of worldviews that celebrate life. And I'll very quickly project a few. So some of us in India have spoken about a sort of a framework which we call eco-swaraj. The word swaraj comes from a very ancient Indian tradition. It became popular in the independence movement in India when Mahatma Gandhi talked about Swaraj. And what he meant by it is very, very important, that it's about autonomy, self-rule. Swaraj means self-rule. Okay. But my autonomy or my community's autonomy in responsibility to your autonomy also. So therefore, it actually makes me understand that I have to restrain myself. I have to restrain my own consumption patterns, and so that I don't undermine your happiness and your autonomy, right? So very simple idea, that we are decision makers wherever we are, in whatever institutions and collectives we are in. But as we take those decisions, we also show responsibility towards other human beings and towards other species and the rest of nature. And which then makes the community, the collective, the center of decision making, not the state, not the private corporation. And so this is just, again, what I meant in terms of Swaraj. I think it's a very important thing to look at, because everybody says democracy. In a very fundamental sense, Swaraj actually is even deeper than democracy, because it encompasses the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, the spiritual into what is really responsible decision making. And there are similar concepts and things from all over the world. From your part of the world, of course, there are so many from indigenous traditions, such as Buen Vivir, Sumak Kause, etc. From Africa, there's Ubuntu, which is, most young people these days think it's a software, but Ubuntu is really the philosophy of I am because we are. That is to say, I'm an individual, and that's important, but I would not be unless there was also a collective. But also a lot of new things coming from the modern world, from the belly of the beast, so to speak, degrowth in Europe, ecofeminism in many parts of the world, and many, many, many others. And it's really what's very important is to try and understand this whole diversity, or what we call the pluriverse of alternative worldviews that is coming about, and to bring them together in the struggle for a recovery from COVID, which is not business as usual, which is unfortunately what a lot of governments are trying. Not even only the Green New Deal, which is coming up strongly in Europe and USA, etc., but actually what I would call a sort of a rainbow New Deal, or a rainbow recovery, which has multiple different kinds of revolutions, ecological, social, etc. An example of that, for instance, is in Hawaii, where there's a eco-feminist kind of a recovery package that has been proposed. And there are similar examples in other parts of the world, mostly, of course, not being listened to by governments, but it's important for us to be able to articulate them and continue fighting for them. Finally, then, this question of scale. We've got all these fantastic examples all over the world. Some are small, some are very large, like the Kurdish and the Zapatista are very large. But still, the macro system remains the same. So how do we create that change? And to me, there are 3 or 4 parts of this, all difficult, but very important. What I call outscaling, not upscaling. Building the bridges between the resistance movement and the constructive alternative. Sometimes they are the same, sometimes not, but creating that. So that we can also think that when we fight the revolution, when we fight against an oppressive regime, we also have some idea of what alternatives we want to put into place, what's called prefigurative, and somebody yesterday told me a transfigurative kind of approaches. Creating much more networking, solidarity amongst all of us, the connection between the so-called local struggle and the global struggles. It's a bit of an artificial divide, but just for the sake of convenience, I'm using that. In the interim, also fighting for policy shifts, because the state is there, the governments are there. So while they're still there, fighting for those policy shifts which enable us to go further towards transformation, and a lot of collective visioning, even as we do the practical struggles, to be able to work together and say, what's the dream? What's the dream of the vision of the future? Lots and lots of questions arise. How do we do this transition? Who will catalyze the transformation? Is it youth? Is it political parties? Is it trade unions? Who will do that? Do we still need a state? If so, what would be its form? What would be global governance? United Nations is been partly very good in terms of the human rights declarations and so on and so forth, very useful, but it has failed in a number of other contexts, such as, for instance, with climate crisis. Do we need a business sector? Will it be private or only public? By public, I mean community and also maybe state. And how do our own professions, whoever from us are in universities and professional life, how does that change? How do we become much more intersectional, much more respectful of different knowledge systems, etc.? So this is the process we use in India to try and raise a lot of these discussions, bring people together, more solidarity, more collaborations, more of a critical mass for change. It's called the Vikalp Sangam, or the Alternatives Confluences, not conference, but confluences, where there's a meeting of minds and hearts and hands. We've had about 20 of these confluences over the last few years on regional or a thematic level. And learning from that experience, and also other similar experiences like Crianza Mutua in Mexico and Colombia and others, trying to create a sort of a bridging mechanism across the world of radical alternative movements, learning from each other, doing more solidarity, more collaboration, and creating more of a critical mass for the larger changes we need. So these are two books that that I've been very privileged to have been part of. The one on the left-hand side is a set of 35 essays of dreaming the future in India, for gender, for sexuality, for conservation, for education, for health, for indigenous peoples, etc., etc. And then coming back to the current situation and saying, what are the pathways of getting to that kind of an ideal world? The one on the right-hand side, which is available both in English and Spanish, and hopefully soon in Portuguese and French, is Pluriverse, which is 100 essays on radical alternatives. A few essays critiquing the current system, but 90 essays on radical alternatives from different parts of the world. Both of these books in English are available for free PDF download. The Spanish one is still something that you have to buy. And this is a website that we help to run, which has lots more examples of this from different parts of the world, stories that are being picked up constantly about these transformations. Just putting the websites again, and I'd be very happy to put people, all of whoever wants to be put on a list that deals both with the global tapestry and with radical ecological democracy. Just put your email in the chat box and I'd be happy to add you on. So with that, Miriam, I'm done with the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great.
I hope I'm more or less on time, and then we can have a...
Yeah, it's all very fine. Thanks. That was a really rich talk. And we already have some questions. I will now switch to Spanish, and I think you have to go to the English translation channel so that everybody understands what I'm saying. Yeah. Muchas gracias, Ashish, por esta conferencia realmente bastante rica e inspiradora. Y afortunadamente ya tenemos algunas preguntas por parte de ustedes. Que voy a entonces transmitir a través de Heather a Ashish. Una persona, Yandri Fernández, pregunta si existe algún texto que recopile todas las alternativas al desarrollo en diferentes partes del mundo.
Thank you. Do you want me to respond one to one?
Yo preferiría que agrupemos 3 preguntas más o menos y que vayas respondiéndolas en grupos.
Okay.
¿Ya? Enrique Cobo, quisiera saber de ti si la economía circular va muy cerca de la ecología y de la cultura. O sea, ¿cuál es tu visión de la economía circular en este debate sobre alternativas? Luis Flores pregunta cómo se podrían involucrar a gente de las clases medias a estos movimientos que tienden a migrar y que son ya imbuidas de la cultura occidental. Si puedes explicar también sobre la resista contra el patriarcado y otros criterios que ha aplicado el grupo Global Working Group Beyond Development. Se nota que Luis Flores ha leído sus textos. Creo que lo dejamos por aquí por ahora y después seguimos, ¿ya? Pero tenemos bastantes preguntas, tenemos 1 hora de tiempo, entonces habría que ver que podamos hacer al menos 2 o 3 rondas más, Ashish, solo para que puedas calcular tus respuestas, su extensión.
Thanks, Miriam, and thanks to the 3 questioners. You know, given the shortage of time, my responses will be a bit will not be comprehensive. They'll be a bit simplistic, but I'm happy to also dialogue after this. If you can use my email, we can do that. In terms of, is there any, I'm sorry, I missed the name of the questioner, but is there any collection of all the alternatives around the world? Well, the book Pluriverse is an attempt to start that. That's what I mentioned. So there are 90 examples of worldviews and or practical examples from different parts of the world. There are worldviews like Sumak Kause and Senti Pensar and so on from Latin America, Ubuntu and many others from Africa, Swaraj and others from Asia, some from the Native Americans in Northern America, some from Europe, but also worldviews and concepts, like I mentioned, things like ecofeminism. In fact, there are 3 or 4 essays on ecofeminism, different parts. For instance, specific ecofeminism, which really looks at the relationship between the sea and feminism. And degrowth, eco-socialism, and many others. Miriam was involved in one of the essays, but that's one of the, so there are 3 sections in the book. The first section is a critique of development, but only 5 essays from different continents. Then there's about 10, 12 essays critiquing the so-called, the superficial or false or within the system solutions, of which I think Miriam was involved with one of them. And then there are 90 essays on the radical alternatives. But what we are doing now is we want to go beyond that, and through the global tapestry of alternatives, we also want to do a much more comprehensive mapping of networks of alternatives. It's impossible to map all the alternatives. There are hundreds of thousands of them, but networks. So for instance, the European Commons Assembly has already got databases of social solidarity commons economy examples in Europe, or the transition movement has examples of where towns are trying to transition into zero carbon or much more ecologically sensitive. So trying to see, okay, what are those sorts of networks available, and how can we create an interactive map in which all of these can look at each other, can interact. So we hope to do that. Please stay in touch with us or visit the Global Tapestry website, and you'll learn more about that. Enrique's question of circular economy. Well, just to point to the fact that there is actually an essay in the in the superficial solutions part of it, in which circular economy is critiqued, not because it's all wrong. I think there's a lot of very strong elements in circular economy, given as an alternative to the sort of linear economy that we have right now, where we create something and then throw it out. But how do we create something in which there is constant feedback and circularity in the production and consumption, is what the circular economy is about. So, and I think that's a lot of there's a lot of very good ideas there. One of the problems and the critiques is that the circular economy does not necessarily fundamentally challenge things like capitalism. So in fact, even capitalist corporations are saying, oh yeah, we will also enter into circular economy. We will be more responsible for our thing, which doesn't then challenge the control over the means of production, the control over consumption, which is also part of the sort of problems of social injustice or economic injustice. So it's a kind of part-way solution, I would say, but we have to go beyond that. Louise has double question. Middle class involvement, including those people who are sort of migrating frequently. I think at least what I've seen in India is that the middle classes get involved for 1 or 2 reasons. One is they're seeing something happening in their own backyard and they get concerned. For instance, they see pollution or waste being dumped or something like that. And if they're there long enough, for 2 or 3 years, they might get concerned enough to be able to act. Which means it's something that's kind of hitting in some way or the other, affecting their lives, and hitting not just the head but also the heart. But the second way in which I've seen middle class involvement is concerns with regard to things like the health of their own children, right? Which is not necessarily immediate. It could be a more long-term kind of thing. What I'm eating right now may not affect me right now, but it might affect me later if there are pesticides or other toxic elements in that. And I think trying to kind of reach across to the middle classes with these sorts of messages, with also the message that that with something like the climate crisis, we're going to have such an incredible level of climate refugees, ecological refugees, pouring into our cities or into places where we as middle class think we are secure, that it's a recipe for huge conflicts. And unless we do something in order to stave that off and help these communities with both adaptation and also their own economic security, it's going to rebound on us. So even from a purely selfish point of view, it seems to me that those who are currently relatively okay in life need to be really, really concerned. With patriarchy, well, since this was also about the global working group, Miriam, maybe you also want to pitch in on this. But I think what we see is, again, from my experience from struggles in India, is that there are two forms in which patriarchy is challenged, at least two forms. One is directly head-on, where you say this is what patriarchy and toxic masculinity is doing, has done for hundreds of thousands of years. And we are equal human beings, and we as women or as different genders, we are equal human beings, and we demand that respect. We demand it through law, through behavior, etc. But the other, which we've seen, for instance, with the women farmers example I gave, is to transform the local economic and political structure in such a way that you're not actually necessarily talking about gender and fighting gender, but it gets transformed. And so, for instance, those women farmers have much greater respect as farmers and as women than they did 20 years back or 30 years back, not necessarily through an anti-patriarchy movement, but through an agricultural transformation, through an economic transformation. So I think there are different pathways of kind of getting to challenging the structures and relations of patriarchy. And one can say the same thing about the structures and relations of capitalism or of statism, racism, etc.
Thanks, Ashish. Entonces, muy bien, seguimos. Angie Castelblanco de Colombia pregunta, en una sociedad de castas, ¿cómo se articulan y trabajan para que propuestas de bienestar sean para todas las personas? ¿Y qué retos ha traído el sistema de castas al proceso de alternativas? ¿Podrías contar cómo el proceso de colonialismo en la India ha afectado la consolidación de alternativas para el bienestar de las comunidades? Esto es la primera pregunta. Luego, Patricio Endara, de Ecuador, quiere saber tu punto de vista sobre el tema de biotecnologías y descontaminación. Más específicamente acerca de la utilización de productos y procesos biotecnológicos para desarrollar negocios ambientales a través de proyectos sostenibles. Como por ejemplo el tratamiento biológico de aguas residuales, la producción de biomasa, el reciclaje biológico de desechos orgánicos sólidos, producción de abonos orgánicos y finalmente uso de, claro, o sea, y su uso en la agricultura orgánica y el aporte de microorganismos naturales concentrados como para descontaminar, si entiendo bien. Entonces, eso es la pregunta de Patricio Endara. Y tenemos a Javier Viteri, de Ecuador también, que quiere saber, considerando los grandes esfuerzos de Gran Sabah para resistir el extractivismo, proponiendo su propia idea de bienestar y autogobierno. Ahora viene la pregunta, ¿cómo han sido vistos esos procesos de autoempoderamiento comunitario por parte del gobierno central? Y específicamente en el ciudadano común de la India, ¿cómo lo digieren? Y otra pregunta también de Javier Viteri, ¿cómo se articulan las alternativas rurales a los espacios urbanos? Y creo que con esto suficiente para esta segunda ronda.
Thank you. Very rich set of questions. I wish we had a few hours to discuss them. Also for me to understand from you, because obviously I don't have all the answers. Angie, the casteism issue and colonialism, you've kind of raised, actually, to my mind, 2 or 3 different questions, but they're also related. I think the relationship between caste and work is a very complex one. We know that in India, caste is both an occupational and a social construct. And you're born into a caste, which means you're born into the occupation that that caste is supposed to be performing, whether you do metal work or you do cleaning of the streets or you do leather work or you're a priest in a temple or whatever. Breaking that system has been very, very difficult because it's hundreds of years old, maybe 1,000 years old. And one of the ways to break it is to actually disengage the social aspects of caste with the occupational aspects of caste. And to be able to argue that regardless of which caste I'm born in, I should have the right to work wherever I want. So even if I'm born, for instance, as a so-called Dalit, as an so-called untouchable, I should have the right to learning and education and become a so-called intellectual or whatever work. And that those who are born into the so-called upper castes should also be performing the physical labor that is required in a community. Now, that's not easy at all. It's been very, very difficult. But that's the kind of struggles that one has to wage. But the other also is to say that because an occupation is related to a caste that is marginalized, doesn't necessarily make the occupation itself of low status. Farming doesn't necessarily need to be low status, even if it is mostly traditionally been by the so-called lower castes. Or crafts, a lot of crafts. We've been working with craftspeople in Western India, handloom weavers. And those handloom weavers in Western India are all from the so-called, again, so-called untouchable caste or Dalits. What they have done is they have they've continued their handloom weaving. In fact, a lot of young men and now even young women are getting back into handloom weaving, but they've broken it away from the caste identity and gained much more respect as incredibly talented artists and craftspeople who are producing some of the most wonderful textiles, for instance, in Western India. So that's another way of trying to break through that. But it's both that and colonialism is an enormous challenge to the world of alternatives, because we can't deal with alternatives unless we tackle these fundamental social issues, and we can't deal with alternatives unless we are decolonizing our minds all the time. That's why I gave the example of the map, the example of language. Unfortunately, a lot of India has to work in English because there's such an incredible diversity of languages that through colonial history, the link language has become English, which is really not in that sense an Indian language, but there we are, which is also the case for a lot of Latin America, for instance, Spanish being the link language. So these are challenges because people are not comfortable necessarily in English. And what they want to express, the depth and the sophistication of what they want to express will be best expressed in their own languages. And in India, we have 780 or 800 living languages, full languages, right? Not dialects, full languages. So that's a huge challenge. How do we sort of create those bridges while people are able to retain their languages? And colonialism is one big obstacle there. Patricio, this is not my field, biological decontamination, biotech, and so on. I think as insofar, I'm just speaking more from general knowledge, insofar as we're using natural products, naturally occurring microorganisms, for instance, for wiping up, for cleaning up pollution, or for enhancing organic farming, to my mind, that's fine. That's probably something that's been happening for a long time. And if modern science can help enhance that, well and good. But when it starts becoming genetic modification and cross engineering and things like that, I mean, some of the most incredibly, I don't know, science fiction kind of scenarios that we're seeing, which is no longer fiction, it's actually happening, that scares me a lot for 2 reasons. One, genetically modified organisms, we don't really know how they're going to react once they're released into the environment. There are no long-term studies which actually show this. And we know a few examples where havoc has been created. Secondly, they are extremely expensive to produce. So it retains a control over the economy for private corporations or governments. The farmers or the local people are no longer in control. Whereas with naturally occurring organisms, they could still have, communities could still be in control. So I think that, I mean, that's a general response I could give, but really this is not my subject. Javier, how has the example that I gave of the Mahagram Sabha, the Federation of Village Assemblies in Central India, how has that been seen? Well, by the state with hostility, because any movement of that kind, I guess anywhere in the world, would threaten the state because they're claiming self-rule. They're not saying we want to break away from India. No, they're saying we want to claim we are the government where we are. But that, of course, threatens the state because it weakens the dominant power of the state over people. So there's been hostility. One of the most prominent activists who's been involved in that movement, helping the villages, has now been in jail for the last 3 years, charged with all kinds of false allegations of being a terrorist and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, these are clauses and laws that our government today is using much more, including this young woman who's been in jail for the last 6 days because of raising issues of climate justice and supporting the farmers movement. So hostility. The general public, it depends on who. In India, there's no such thing as the general public, right? So it depends on who one is talking to. A lot of young people, when I give this example, are really excited, saying, "Oh, wow, this can happen. Why should it not happen everywhere?" A lot of others who are, brainwashed into kind of more right-wing kind of stuff say, "Oh, no, this is anti-national. It's secessionist. It's breaking India apart." So it really depends on who you're talking to when you look at public opinion on something like this. And therefore, in fact, the last point that you made is very, very important. How do you create a much greater dialogue between the rural and the urban, between the different classes in society, between youth in cities and youth in villages, to enable a much greater understanding, to dissolve the myths that get built up with stereotypes? Stereotypes are the government is always corrupt, local people are always illiterate, they don't know what to do, etc. Or Hindus are like this, Muslims are like that. And creating that dialogue, the space for open dialogue and trusting dialogue is so very important. There are some processes of that happening in India, but not nearly enough. So we need much more of this building of bridges. And one of the things we did in this last 1 year is webinars by people in villages to be able to speak to urban populations, to tell their story of the kind of transformations that they're attempting. I think we need much more of that. Miriam, over to you.
Ok, great. Entonces, seguimos. Tenemos todavía un buen paquete de preguntas. El primero es de José Luis Ricapa, de Perú, y pregunta, en el contexto actual de crisis, agravada por la crisis sanitaria del COVID, ¿cuáles son las amenazas que han surgido para que la propuesta del eco-swaraj siga siendo aplicada por comunidades y personas? ¿Y cómo se prepara el movimiento o tiene estrategias para enfrentar estas amenazas? La segunda pregunta es de Alejo Diricio, de Argentina, que pregunta qué herramientas y estrategias piensas son las más efectivas para mirar futuros alternativos. O sea, para promover visiones alternativas de nuestro futuro. Más concretamente, ¿piensas que la ficción tiene algún rol en esto y que puede fortalecer nuestra capacidad de construir nuestras visiones de futuro? Luego tenemos a Héctor Pérez, que es de Venezuela y que pregunta qué tan decisiva es la espiritualidad en las aldeas para influenciar o sostener su relación con la naturaleza. Y una última para esta ronda, Rosama, que no sé dónde viene, te pregunta te pide que digas un poquito más sobre la tecnología. ¿Es necesario restringir la tecnología y su rol para que nosotros, la gente, no nos volvamos obsoletos?
Okay, thanks. Another great set of questions. I'm just finishing writing them down so I don't forget them. So yes, Jose, right? The first question. In India, I think the greatest threats during the COVID period has been one significant destabilization of the economy of those who are already marginalized, people who are, say, laborers in construction sites, migrant workers in our cities, small scale farmers who are dependent on selling their produce to into the city. And when not COVID so much as the lockdown happened in India as elsewhere in the world, everything was shut down. So you couldn't get your produce to the market. Laborers had no work anymore. They had to. Some of the most atrocious things the government of India did was not prepare for it well enough to be able to transport workers back to their villages. So we had situations where people had to walk 1,000 kilometers, and I'm not exaggerating here. Walk 1,000 kilometers just to get back home, because there were no buses, no trains, no nothing, and they couldn't stay back in the city because they had no job. And these are people who depend on a daily wage. Every day they'll get paid, and then they'll buy their food using that. So we had this happening for millions of people. That's one thing. The second big threat, and so out of that, the question arises: how do you rebuild an economy in which people are not going back to the same insecure jobs, but to create livelihoods of dignity, which will enable them to survive, maybe say the next such uh, um, crisis, which is why we're doing this documentation of where people were able to be resilient and why they were able to be resilient, and how do we create and more of these sorts of communities. The second big threat was, as I briefly hinted at, was the fact that the COVID period was used by our government, one, to become more authoritarian, use it to have more surveillance. For instance, we were all supposedly supposed to have mandatorily an app on our phones, which was a so-called health app, but it was also an app by which you could be traced and tracked wherever you are in the country, how you're traveling, etc., and other things like that, using a sort of a health emergency thing as an excuse. But also pushing through policy decisions where they knew there was nobody out on the streets. You couldn't be out on the streets to protest. So you just make these decisions with online platforms saying, okay, I'm going to pass a big dam over there. I'm going to pass a highway through that. I mean, all cleared, without any kind of environmental appraisal, or the laws, the farm laws, for instance, which were attempted. Unfortunately for them, they didn't realize that the kind of mobilization farmers could do, regardless of COVID or no COVID, was well beyond their expectation. But that's the kind of thing that, so these are the threats. To build eco-swaraj out of that, one would have to do what's happening now with the farmers movement, where it's not just anymore a farmers movement. There's expressions of solidarity and protest happening across the country from trade unions, other kinds of worker groups, indigenous peoples, Dalit organizations, environmental groups, including the ones that are currently being targeted by the government, and many others, academics, lawyers, etc. And it's, if out of this some kind of a broader coalition can be built, which is fighting for ecological and social and economic justice, then maybe we can move a bit more towards the eco-swaraj kind of thing. But it's going to be very difficult and very long drawn out. Alejo, I think that's a great question. I think purely academic and intellectual work is not nearly enough. Somebody told me recently that a story remains in your head and your heart 100 times more effectively than an academic article. So yes, it can be non-fiction stories telling, and it can be fictional storytelling. I don't know how many of you have read. I was amazed, for instance, at the range of things that has been picked up in this new science fiction novel called The Ministry for the Future. It's probably also available in Spanish now. Kim Stanley Robinson is a science fiction writer, and he's covered the whole range of issues relating to the climate crisis. the technological, the political, the economic, the social, all sorts of things in a fiction, in the form of science fiction. And he talks about 2045, 2049, where the world has begun to actually change towards a more idealistic, more utopian vision. And he shows how that is done, including through a little bit of acts of terrorism and all that, but also a lot of rethinking of alternatives, of economies, etc. So it's fascinating. And to my mind, a novel like that would probably influence many more people than my writing or Miriam's writing, academic stuff in journals, right? Which doesn't say that we shouldn't do that. We, of course, also have to do that. Music. I think it was the Doors who produced a video during the COVID lockdown talking about COVID and climate, if I'm not mistaken. You know, coming back from, I don't know, from almost oblivion. And so I think the ability to
actually,
create.
Alejo is a filmmaker. Maybe he's asking from this perspective.
Yes, I was just going to come to films. Yeah. that movies, that films that are both apocalyptic but also utopian. I think we need filmmakers to actually make things that also show the hope, grounded hope. I'm not saying just abstract, but grounded hope. You know, there isn't nearly enough on the amazing alternatives all around the world. There is some material, but very little. There's a lot on the disasters and so on, which is very important. But we also need this kind of thing. So if you're a filmmaker, I'd invite you to if you're not already doing it, to please consider also both feature films or fiction, but also documentaries on stories of hope. So yeah, all of that is very, very, very important because it reaches people's hearts, which is the most important way of transforming. Hector, I think spirituality is absolutely crucial. I don't mean mainstream religion, because that's a very controversial place to go, but spirituality in terms of our relationship with the rest of nature. And in Indian villages, it's changing very rapidly, unfortunately, towards materialism. But otherwise, a lot of traditions of relating to the forest or to the seed. You know, the example I gave you of the Dalit women farmers, every year they have a whole series of festivals which they celebrate where they worship the seed and the earth and water. Yeah, so it's a material and physical relationship with seeds and earth and water, but it's also a very deeply spiritual relationship. But they don't do it only from one religion. They'll do it with an Islamic festival, with a Hindu festival, with a Jain festival, with a Christian festival, and their own local traditions. So I think that's a very, very important way of continuing to remain, to have nature being influencing our lives, and us having a much more peaceful relationship with the rest of nature and with each other. Rosamma, who's from India, by the way, Miriam, she's a friend. Technology, yeah. See, the thing is that technology has kind of obviously overtaken our lives in many different ways, but that's because we've allowed it to. Yeah, you don't have, you know, I mean, barring science fiction where we talk about robots taking over the earth, which may happen, I don't know. But other than that, we can still control these technologies. But in order to do that, we need the democratization that is so important of who controls technologies, who asks the questions, who is dictating technological development. And that's why I put those points there, that we have to be able to, just as we democratize politics and economy, means of production, obviously also technology has to be done. Very difficult, but it has to be done. But open source technologies, for instance, is a way of doing that. Fighting against intellectual property rights is a way of doing that. Fighting against the corporations that are today controlling or creating the most incredibly abominable technologies is a way of doing that. But also not succumbing to the consumerism which perpetuates those technologies. As I said, like buying the latest iPhone. I'm sorry, I'm using iPhone as an example. It could be any such gadget. So personal changes also, even as we do those collective sort of processes of transformation, even the way we live our own lives, do we support these undemocratic technologies or do we support democratic technologies? We can do a lot of changes in our own lives also to reflect that.
Okay, great. I hope you still have a bit of breath.
Yes,
This is intense, and it's also very inspiring still. So, tenemos ahora la pregunta de Rosa Zúñiga, que creo que es de Ecuador, que pregunta si hablar de economía social implica hablar de medio ambiente y bienes comunes, o si son procesos diferentes. Luego, Nadia Ramos.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I'm not sure I got that.
I can repeat it in English. If to talk of social economy implies automatically talking about the environment and common goods, or these are different processes. Nadia Ramos de Ecuador nos pregunta cómo el feminismo en los sures cuestiona el modelo de desarrollo en conjunto con el pensamiento ecológico, o sea, cuál sería la contribución del feminismo del sur a la crítica del modelo de desarrollo y en qué medida se alía con el pensamiento ecológico. Karina Marcano, de Venezuela, nos pregunta ¿cómo se puede fomentar el cambio sobre las necesidades y aspiraciones de las personas que son hoy día modeladas o influenciadas por el capitalismo y el consumismo a la par de la educación, ya que no todas las personas están en edad escolar y que muchos otros no tienen acceso a la educación? ¿Cuáles serían estos espacios alternativos construidos en el contexto de las alternativas? Entiendo que para la educación diferente, ¿no? Y voy a agregar una más. Dado el tamaño de la India y las diferencias entre estados, ¿qué alternativas hay para los adivasis, los indígenas, que son encarcelados o asesinados por defender su medio de vida y cuyas tierras les quieren ser expropiados para proyectos mineros? ¿De qué manera se puede generar conciencia a la sociedad, en la sociedad en general, acerca de esta realidad? Con eso nos quedamos.
Thanks. What was the name of the last one and the second one?
The last one is Mer Ekeko from India. Okay. And the second one was Nadia from Ecuador. The third one is Karina from Venezuela.
Yeah. So the first one, Rosa's question on is the social economy necessarily or automatically involving the environment and the commons? I guess that will depend on how one defines it, but the way in which the commons movement and the social and solidarity movement in Europe, for instance, has characterized, or in Latin America has characterized what they call the social and solidarity economy, does necessarily encompass notions of the commons, notions of justice, equality, and sustainability. So it wouldn't work without that, because then it would not be social and solidarity based. So to my mind, yes, it very much has to be including in there. Miriam, maybe you can add to that from your own context. Feminism of the South and its critique of development and its relationship to ecology. I would take two examples to look at that. One is the Kurdish women's movement and their ideology of what I said was genealogy. And from whatever I know of them, having spoken to a lot of the Kurdish women movement people and read stuff, it seems to me that their critique of modern development or modernity in some senses is very much based on a critique of both patriarchy and the human domination of the earth. And so in that sense, we can think of certain strands of feminism, especially ecofeminism kind of strands from different parts of the world, as being fundamentally, and arising from the South especially, as being basically critiquing of development, linking to ecology, but also, and maybe this is a difference between the southern and the northern, is or the global south and the global north, is also deeply linking to cultural and spiritual aspects. And this is fascinating. For instance, if you look at what's happening with the Kurdish women, or if you take, for instance, some of the eco-feminist movements in India, they don't call themselves eco-feminists. They could be calling themselves lots of things. You will find this combination of a deep critique of modern Western modernity, a deep critique of development with economic growth and materialism and all of that, a deep critique of patriarchy from a justice point of view, but also a deep critique uh, of a world which believes only in rationality, only in the head, and doesn't go into the sort of cultural, spiritual, the heart, so to speak. And I find that maybe in that sense it's different from the way in which feminism comes from the north or from the global north. But again, some of you might be more expert on this than I am, so please feel free to come in on this. Karina, how does one influence? Well, you put consumerism and what young people are going through, and then different spaces of education and learning. So the examples I know of are where either inside of formal educational institutions or outside of them, like the examples I put up in the slide, or for instance, what's called forest schools in Eastern Europe, or the multiversities and pluriversities in different parts of the world, or where there's been an attempt to actually recreate community learning spaces so that you're not just within a certain four walls of a school, but it's a much more open kind of an atmosphere. Or the examples where the young people and the teachers or the mentors are creating their own curriculum together, creating the spaces of learning together. So it's not just happening here and then being passed down, but actually people are much more democratic spaces of actually creating the pedagogies in some sense or the other. I think these are really the ones that we need to learn from and expand significantly, and to change the mainstream models of education towards these kinds of much more open systems of learning, where the professor is not just a person like Miriam and me, but also the local indigenous person who knows 400 species in the forest, may not know how to read and write, but has an incredibly deep knowledge of the forest, or a Dalit woman who can talk for hours about the seeds that she's planting and the earth that she's planting it in, and so they become teachers also, right? And so I think that to me those are really the systemic alternatives to learning and education, with the de-schooling model that Ivan Illich spoke about. Mayor, I think, yes, in terms of the size and diversity of India and the alternatives for Adivasis and what's happening to Adivasis, indigenous peoples in many parts of India, this is a really tough one, because unfortunately what's happened is that along with the caste system, we have also inherited a system in which indigenous people are considered to be backward, uncivilized, primitive, and they have to be, right from independence, there's been this whole narrative of they have to be civilized. People don't say that anymore because it's politically inappropriate, but they have to be brought into the mainstream. What is the mainstream? The mainstream is somebody like me who's living in a city, who can speak into an online platform like this, who can speak English, who wears clothes or wears certain kinds of clothes, who eat certain kinds of things, etc. All of which traditional Adivasi society would not be doing. They would have their own ways of doing all of this, right? But that's considered old-fashioned, outmoded. And the most dangerous part to this is where the education system has been imposed in these societies in such a way that their children are being brainwashed into thinking that their parents are backward, that their Adivasi way of life is backward. It's not nearly as bad as what happened to children in Australia and Canada, the so-called stolen generations, but it's almost as bad. In South India, for instance, in the state of Orissa, there's one institution, the institution of learning, which has something like 20,000 Adivasi children in it. in a mainstream city, and they're taught the mainstream language, that everything, and so they get alienated from their own parents and their families and their society, and they start thinking of in the way that uh, that governments and corporations want them to think. So how do we change that is an enormously difficult one. We have to change the cultural perceptions of Adivasis. We have people like me, for instance, have to go and write about and talk about the fact that, gosh, in our cities we're talking about protecting the environment. There they've been doing it all along. They respect the environment, they know it. So why don't we learn from them rather than trying to bring them into our mainstream? And we've been trying to get universities to call Adivasis to their institutions and to speak to students about their knowledge and their ways of life, and to take those students to those Adivasi areas so that they can actually really see what's happening. This is not to romanticize either urban life or Adivasi life, but to say that there's complex realities, and to create the learning opportunities for people to understand those complex realities and respect diverse ways of living, and understand that if we want to tackle the climate crisis or any of the other ecological crises, if we want to tackle the kind of social inequalities and so on, that and economic inequalities that are so abysmal in our society, we have to learn from the Adivasis, because they have done this much better than we in our cities are doing. Very tough, but we have to do it, and some of that is happening.
Okay, that was it, Ashish, for this round of questions?
Yes, Miriam, I think so, unless
Great.
I missed something.
We have one last round, I would say. The first question is from Sumac Sandoval from Ecuador. Y voy a cambiar al español para que todos entiendan y todas. Sumac Sandoval nos pregunta, en el proceso de democratización de la economía, ¿cuáles han sido las principales dificultades? Y cómo ir de la praxis a la ejecución en los diferentes, creo que es de la teoría a la ejecución en los diferentes territorios. Luego tenemos una pregunta de Mar Daza, de Perú, que nos pregunta, como tejido global, activistas e intelectuales por alternativas civilizatorias, ¿qué hacen para combatir los pactos y violencias coloniales, clasistas y patriarcales dentro del mismo tejido y o dentro del movimiento de activistas por alternativas civilizatorias? Me refiero más a los espacios como el tejido de alternativas, los espacios universitarios o el grupo de trabajo de intercambios, los grupos de trabajo de intercambios globales. Rosa Zúñiga nos recuerda que ella es de México. Disculpas, Rosa, yo solo tenía este nombre como un nombre familiar de la Ecosol de CEAL. Y como siguiente pregunta, tenemos a Pamela Rodríguez de Ecuador, que quiere saber qué tan fuerte es el papel que desempeñan los jóvenes y las mujeres en los procesos de lucha y resistencia en las comunidades swaraj. ¿Son escuchados en los espacios importantes de toma de decisiones respecto a las nuevas alternativas? Y terminamos con María Elena, y no puedo ver el apellido. María Elena de Ecuador, en economías cuya principal fuente de ingresos es la exportación de commodities, ¿cómo se puede balancear el cuidado ambiental con la financiación de servicios básicos estatales, sin recurrir a la explotación de minerales que hoy tienen alta demanda? O sea, son muy requeridas en el mercado mundial, ¿no? Eso, entonces con esto cerraríamos las preguntas. Por favor, si desean todavía pueden poner comentarios, pero ya no tendríamos tiempo para una siguiente ronda de preguntas en este espacio. Ashish, por favor.
Thank you, Miriam. Sumak's question of economic democratization, the main difficulties facing economic democratization. So there are many, and they would also, some of them would be general and common to all regions of the world. Some of them would be specific to the given context. I think the way in which economic globalization has happened across most of the world, one thing that we all face in common is the power of the capitalist corporation, and increasingly the power of the capitalist corporation hand in glove with the state. And this is unfortunately also true for many of the so-called socialist states. Of course, it is very true for the right-wing states, but also sometimes for left. And so if we want to build economic democratization, suppose, for instance, there's a movement which says, I want complete control. We want control, the food sovereignty movement, as an example, or energy sovereignty or water sovereignty movements, where communities are saying we should be in control of these things, not governments, not corporations. They are immediately going to run up against these powerful forces who don't want that to happen because it weakens their domination and their power. So that's one of the biggest things. The second, I think, big difficulty is decolonizing the mind. When people work with farmers, for instance, or when farmers try and change things internally, one of the biggest challenges they face is this mindset that is because of the brainwashing of the so-called green revolution in India, where everybody's got convinced that the only way to develop as a farmer is to go in for chemicals and hybrid seeds and genetic modified organisms, GMOs and seeds and so on. And so the struggle to move towards a more food sovereignty, local, organic, biologically diverse farming system has to confront this mindset, which is not just in the corporations, it's also in the minds of ordinary farmers. And the same thing you can say about any other kind of producer or consumer. So so it's the structures of domination in capitalism and state dominated societies, but it's also these ways of thinking, of the social and the cultural and the psychological that has to be confronted, which is very difficult because we've had decades and decades of brainwashing about what is a good life, right? And so this is something we face even in the communities of transformation, where some of the most brilliant things have happened. When these communities are able to take back control over their forests and be able to earn a livelihood from those forests, one of the big struggles is many of the people in the village then want to build concrete houses, cement houses, get a car or a motorcycle or the latest phone, etc. And I'm not blaming them, because that's what we do. So we have set those examples. So how do you create a system in which even as the community struggles against the state and creates self-rule and self-governance, they also ask themselves the question of what is really a good life? Is it the consumerist way that people like me have gone, or are there other ways to do it? And then to teach me how to live more responsibly and so on. So that's one big, these are multiple challenges that are faced, but there are also examples where those challenges have been confronted successfully. And I can give many examples of that maybe offline later to you. Mar Dasa's question of fighting colonialism and patriarchy in our own groups, I think that's very, very, very important. Last year, we had a democracy Vikalp Sangam, that is one of our alternatives confluences, was on democracy, about 60, 70 people from all over the country getting together. And we spoke about democratizing the state, about radical democracy, all of that. But one of the discussions, very complex one, was also about democracy within our own institutions, our civil society organizations, our people's movements, our universities, or whatever. And we found, and this is nothing surprising for anybody, but the more we ask these questions, the more we find that actually we often don't practice the ideals we want the government to practice, or corporations to practice, or the outside world to. So women, gender ratios, for instance, which is some of the simplest sorts of things. Who is really taking decisions? what language are we using in the organization, which automatically excludes people who don't have the same kind of language. I don't mean only English, Hindi kind of thing. I also mean, jargon, for instance. And so so one of the things we use is this tool that we call the Alternatives Transformation Framework, which is a tool we developed 3 or 4 years back to try and assess transformations, or to help communities assess their own transformations from the multiple perspectives that I gave you on that flower of transformation. So supposing I'm transforming politically, much more self-rule, how am I doing on the social justice front? How am I doing on the ecological sustainability front? How am I doing on the economic democracy? If I can think of, have a process over a few years of trying to self-assess, maybe with some assistance, then at least I realize where the problems are, and then I try, hopefully, to make those changes. But we often don't ask ourselves those questions. So I'm glad you raised that very, very important question. Pamela, how strong is the role of youth and women? This differs from place to place. Many of the transformations are transformations that the somewhat relatively more well-to-do or more powerful people in that community have been able to do, because they have the possibility of doing that. They have the external connections, they have the, they know what the laws are, or they might have the financial resources to make that transformation happen. But they do it with the best of intentions, and sometimes it actually works very well. But there are also many examples where more marginalized sections, including youth and women, have been the ones to lead the transformation, or to ask the right questions, which leads to the transformation. We have lots of examples, for instance, of community conservation of forests, which is led by women. We have examples where excessive hunting has been challenged and stopped by young people, saying that, okay, you elders did what you did, but we want wildlife to be protected in our ecosystems. Or youth bringing conflicting parts of the community together. These conflicting parts of the community have gone for hundreds of years. They've been fighting each other, either on caste lines or on religious lines or whatever. And it's a newer generation of young people who have seen through that and said, why do we do this? We want to work together. Sometimes it works through games. They play football together, and after playing football, there's relaxing and taking a break, and they start talking about saying, why does my father fight with your father? I mean, we're all human beings, right? So there's fantastic initiatives are trying to create these things through sports, or through common learning spaces, or through craft, or other kinds of fun activities, creative activities, where you also then start talking about gender, casteism, patriarchy, religion, and so on. So there are many examples of that kind of very strong role by youth and women, but we need many more. The last one by Maria, financing of basic services, government or state services that we all need, without the exploitation of minerals. I'm not sure anybody has a good answer to that. The only thing I can think of is, and this includes things like energy, of course, is the answer that somebody like Mahatma Gandhi gave, which is to move to much more simpler lifestyles, so that we're not demanding more and more and more. Because if we demand more and more, it's going to come from somewhere. The Green New Deal in the USA, many fantastic ideas there. But one of the things it says is, instead of fossil fuels, everybody will have an electric car. Now, somewhere mining has to be done for those electric cars, and it's probably going to be in the global south. So unless we question these fundamentals of how we want to live, what is a good life, I think we don't have an answer to this. Because renewable energy, if we keep demanding more and more energy, it's going to be destructive. It is destructive already in many parts of the world, where huge amounts of land are being taken over for solar mega parks and wind energy and so on. So it's a very difficult but fundamental question. How can we be happy as human beings without this kind of a consumerist lifestyle? And if we do that, then I think basic needs can be met without the kind of extractivism that we're seeing all over the world. There's no reason why we can't have enough water, enough, what do we need minerals for? We need minerals, let's say, for construction. Now, if we all start thinking about how can we do construction based on local materials, we probably would have much less of an extractivist footprint, right? Do we need the latest I keep saying iPhone. Do we need the latest cell phone, which creates mining, which can only happen by mining in the Congo basin? No. Can we go to forms of communication which are much less resource intensive, including just talking to each other, picking up an ordinary phone and talking to each other, whatever? I don't know. Nobody has all the answers. We'll have to explore our way, but always asking this fundamental question: what we consume or what service we demand from the government, what is its impact on somebody else, somewhere else, including some other species? And the more we do that, I think the more we will move towards what so many people in history have talked about: simplicity of the notion of enoughness, not of more and more and more and more. Very difficult questions, very difficult ways to go. But without that, I think we are not going to be able to tackle the incredible civilizational collapse that we are facing. Thanks.
Yo quisiera entrar aquí para complementar un poco esta última respuesta de Ashish, recordándonos que estamos viviendo en un mundo extremadamente desigual en cuanto a riqueza y patrimonio, y que hay propuestas de gente como Tomás Piketty, pero también aquí en el Ecuador y en América Latina que circulan, que una buena fuente para financiar al menos una transición hasta estos otros modos de vida más suficientes, más, o sea, que no son tan expansionistas, podría ser una reforma impositiva que precisamente tome lo que se necesita para la transición de estas personas que son las más beneficiadas de las décadas destructivas, ¿no? Entonces tendríamos un reequilibrio de la riqueza y al mismo tiempo la posibilidad de precisamente tener algún respiro, digamos, en términos de ingresos públicos para los servicios básicos, etcétera. Pero coincido totalmente con Ashish de que si no disminuimos el metabolismo social general de nuestras sociedades, no hay solución. O sea, no podemos aspirar todos al mismo modo de vida que los norteamericanos y pensar que esto se va a hacer de manera sustentable. Ashish, yo quisiera cerrar esto con una pregunta que yo te quisiera hacer y antes de hacer una serie de anuncios, o tal vez voy a empezar con los anuncios. Tenemos otro evento mañana en este ciclo de conferencias con Patricia Gualinga de la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Ella nos va a hablar del Causaxacha, que es la propuesta que emana de la comunidad organizada de Sarayaku, del pueblo ancestral quichua amazónico, para relacionarnos precisamente con la naturaleza de otra manera, pero también para pensar y enfrentar el cambio climático de otra manera y todo lo que sería políticas ambientales. El miércoles, esto va a ser mañana a las 10 de la mañana y pueden encontrar en el sitio web de la Universidad Andina el link para inscribirse. El miércoles a las 11:30 de la mañana tenemos una mesa redonda con 4 ponentes de diferentes partes del mundo. Está Adrián Belling de Argentina, Susan Paulson de Florida en Estados Unidos, Natalia Green y Fernando Vega de aquí del Ecuador, y vamos a justamente entrar más a profundidad a esa cuestión de qué entendemos por una buena vida que acaba de mencionar Ashish y cómo visibilizamos esta buena vida si estamos sometidos a indicadores como el crecimiento económico abstracto que refleja el Producto Interno Bruto, que solo nos habla justamente del crecimiento del metabolismo social, que es lo que tenemos que reducir, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué alternativas tenemos en esta perspectiva para mostrar la calidad de vida de otra manera después de que la hayamos entendido de otra manera? Y finalmente el jueves cerramos este ciclo con una conferencia dialógica sobre los comunes o lo común y su poder subversivo. Vamos a tener a Raquel Gutiérrez desde México y a Silke Helfrich desde Alemania. Ambas tienen una amplia trayectoria tanto teórica como también práctica y militante alrededor del tema de los comunes. Esto va a ser a las 9 de la mañana el jueves. Ahora, Ashish, solo para reconectarnos un poco con la actualidad en la India, ¿cuál sería tu lectura de si estas enormes protestas campesinas que están ya desarrollándose desde hace meses ahora, o sea, ¿qué potencial tienen de poder realmente parar esta reforma de políticas agrarias? Porque entiendo que esta ley agraria que propone el gobierno de Modi también sería una agresión a muchos de estos procesos alternativos, modos de vida otros de tu país que nos acabas de comentar. Entonces, ¿cómo ves la relación de fuerzas ahí y las perspectivas de esta lucha? Y sobre todo para cerrar tal vez, ¿qué maneras, qué posibilidades ves para nosotros desde América Latina de solidarizarnos con esta lucha?
Sure, Miriam, I think it's good note to end on. I think we've all been surprised, and certainly the government has been surprised by the resilience and the tenacity of this current movement. I mean, some people are saying it's the world's largest strike and so on. I don't know about the numbers, but certainly in terms of the sheer resilience and the sort of willpower that has been shown by these farmers, it's pretty incredible. Also, if you think of it, they're camping out in some of the coldest parts of the year and in very difficult situations, but they're still sticking it out. Will this lead to the withdrawal of these 3 laws? Nobody can say. The farmers have said until it's withdrawn, we're not moving from here, and we can take a year if you want. And they're even saying we can take all the way till 2024 when the next elections are happening. So it's going to be obviously a war of attrition, as they say. So we'll have to see. What I think is good is, as I said earlier, there's a lot of solidarity coming in from non-farming sectors, well, from farmers from other parts of India, but also non-farming sectors, which keeps the hope and the resilience going. But I mean, the forces they're up against. What we are seeing, Miriam, here is the attempted transformation of the last stronghold of small farmer-based agriculture in the world, the last stronghold. There are, of course, Latin America also has a lot, but India is way by far the largest. I mean, 100, 200 million people or more, which has not, despite all the attempts, has not become completely sold out to the corporate commodified sector. And so the corporation, the capitalist forces of the world and the WTOs and whoever sort of backs them up, the World Economic Forum, etc., they all have been eyeing India and how do you transform this situation into one that feeds global capital, right? And that's one of the origins of these 3 laws. In fact, people have shown historically how the 3 laws emanate from American WTO kind of moves from some of them even from like 20, 30 years back, same arguments that you can see in these laws now. So it's not going to be an easy battle at all. We're up against not just the government of India, but global economic capitalist forces. So let's see. And there, I think solidarity from the rest of the world is very, very, very important. We've already seen, I think, something like 70, 80 farmer unions and organizations in the US have expressed solidarity just a couple of days back and talked about how their lives were transformed in the Reagan administration into much more commodification, commercialization, and into the hands of corporations. And they don't want the same thing to happen to Indian farmers. So they have expressed their solidarity and support. We need that kind of thing happening from all over the world, from peasant organizations, indigenous groups, people like yourselves, to be able to keep bolstering the spirit and the resilience and the resolve of these farmers. And in turn, these farmers will express solidarity with struggles in other parts of the world. So I think that internationalization or globalization of struggles and solidarity, which has been happening, needs to happen much, much more.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ashish. So we are now at the end of this public part and I have to switch languages. Muchísimas gracias a Ashish por compartirnos esta gran riqueza de conocimiento tan diversa que nos ha traído en esta jornada. Gracias también a ustedes por sus preguntas realmente muy profundas, muy ricas también. Y nos despedimos. Ojalá